Hello, welcome. Welcome to San Francisco Design Week, and welcome to this panel. It's called Things We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Design. It's basically a game show where we try to figure out what the client meant. No, actually, this is a panel about design criticism and its current state and why it's important and where it needs to go. And I've got two great panelists with me today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Molly.
Hi, my name is Molly Heinz, and I'm the chair of a one-year master's program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City called Design Research, Writing, and Criticism. And I'm also the co-founder of an editorial consultancy called Superscript.
Hi guys, I am Ann Quito. I am the design and architecture reporter for Quartz, which is the Atlantic's global business news site. So at Quartz, I have two jobs. I report on design, but I'm also their in-house design critic. So I point and chew, which is kind of a way to think about a job.
Right. And my name is Khoi Vinh. I am principal designer here at Adobe, where this is hosted this evening. And I work on products, and I also work in the design community with our customers. So I'm going to start tonight just by asking a really simple question, starting with you, Molly.
Okay.
Why is design criticism important? Why should we even be here?
So design criticism is important, and I think criticism in general is important because it is an opportunity to reflect and put the subject in a broader cultural context. And so I think there are other fields that have a much longer tradition of criticism, design-related fields like architecture, but design does not have this robust history of criticism, and I think it's something that's a problem and something that's necessary. It's something that people like Anne are trying to address, and something that we're working with our students to think about and hopefully be proactive about being a new generation of design critics, but we can talk more about what exactly that means.
And why is design criticism important?
Gosh, this feels like a quiz.
Yeah.
Well, I think without criticism, design becomes a cottage industry versus a cultural force. I'm a fan of design, and I'm also a graphic designer. And without critics, the conversation remains among ourselves and never becomes part of the public conversation. And selfishly, I think without criticism, people tend to undermine design. They think it just kind of happens with all the super fast Adobe software, right? But there's a lot of thinking, a lot of like nuance, a lot of things that go behind something. So my job is to sort of like suss it out and surface it. So I think critic does that.
Let me ask you, or pose a theory to you. The design industry has been really diligent about arguing for why design is important for at least 10 or 20 years, if not more, especially in the age of companies like Apple and Facebook and Google. Do you think that design criticism has contributed to those companies taking design seriously and helping us get a seat at the table, or do you think design criticism has been missing in that process?
Start.
I'm not really sure. First of all, very few in the public realm know what design is. I think that's still, it's so many specializations. So many slices to the pie. So I'm not sure there's a direct correlation between how wonderful Apple is or how wonderful Adobe is to the work of any heart-pounding critical writer. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about design and about also a lot of people like my mom or my dad doesn't really know that design shapes the world. And there's a lot to be said about like how those seats, those lights really condition how you feel, I'm not sure that's been done enough.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if Adobe should be paying homage to some design critic.
But Khoi, what you were saying about these companies valuing design, it's something that has come from the inside out because of leadership that does recognize what the role of design can be, and implementing it, and having that land well with the consumer market. And however, now these companies that do have design as such a big part of what they do are needing to be held accountable, and they're responsible for what they're putting out there. And I think that's when the role of the critic becomes important, and it's somebody who is, outside that company, ideally outside that kind of inner circle, and being able to take a position and say, okay, let's really look at this and start to evaluate how design is working in this context and possibly what could be better.
So when you say hold design accountable, I think were the words you used roughly. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? Do you mean hold design accountable for the business results, or do you mean hold design accountable for something more?
Well, I think when I talk about it in general, I'm talking about it from a consumer perspective and a user perspective. So, in a basic way, is this design functioning like it should, or is it living up to its potential as a designed product? And I think whether or not that affects the bottom line of a company is really secondary to the concerns of a user.
Right.
Yeah.
Can either of you give me any examples of the design work that's being done in the tech industry that might bear closer scrutiny?
Gosh, everything. No?
Well,
Everything?
yeah, I mean, well, in our program, one thing that we're working on doing is talking about digital design as part of our curriculum, and evaluating that, along with design that's, let's say, more traditional fields of design like architecture and industrial design and graphic design. And because digital design is sometimes visible, but sometimes it's not visible, and compared to these other fields, less tangible perhaps, it's a challenge to apply, let's say, more traditional modes of methods of criticism to it in some ways. So we're trying to kind of get our heads around that. But for example, one question we've been asking this past year is, how do you critique the design of an algorithm? Because that is a piece of design that has really massive implications for users, and maybe it's not something that users think about necessarily as a design. But it is a design that we should be paying attention to.
I wanted to add, on a very practical level, technology shapes kind of like our lives now. And I was thinking about this mode of design called anticipatory design, where you basically relegate all decision making to, I guess, Internet of Things. You relegate all your decision makings to sort of like a formula. It kind of knows your options, and it will decide if you need an Uber. It will decide what you're going to wear. This is the utopia designers paint. But isn't that prone to corruption? Or I think you need a critic in there,
Right.
an independent mind to sort of suss that out.
Yeah, examining the defaults, the defaults in design are
Exactly.
incredibly impactful. But
Exactly.
we take them for granted. Is that part of what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So you teach a program, or you're the chair of a program that is essentially turning out design critics. And I want to ask a little bit about the question of who should be the critic. To some extent, there's a lot of writing going on in the design industry right now. I mean, you fire up Medium or you go to Designer News, there's tons of writing every day, there's something new, and it's quite robust and quite communal, and in many ways very constructive. But for the most part, those are designers, practicing designers who are writing about design. Is this sufficient? Is this a good situation, a bad situation? What do you guys think?
I mean, I think it's certainly, I think, fair enough and fine for designers to be writing about design and speaking to each other professionally, but that is keeping the conversation fairly small and insular. And I think what we're interested in doing in our program is training people to write for broader audiences, consumer audiences, and to do that, I would hesitate to say that we're stamping out critics, because I think being able to write criticism well is something that comes with years of experience. But the foundation of criticism, what we teach our students is that the foundation of criticism is reporting, and to be a credible critic, you have to start with reporting. You have to know your facts cold,
Right.
and you build an argument based on those facts. So, we have, it's a like almost like building a building. Like you're trained to be a reporter. You work on your writing and rhetorical skills, and then develop a point of view and based on what you've learned. And so then hopefully you can go on to write an informed and compelling and engaging piece of criticism. But it's not something that just happens automatically. And I think the really thinking about who you're writing for and who the audience is, and being in a position to stand outside it all and not be entangled, perhaps, with the baggage of, oh well, who's my next job going to be with,
Right.
or who's going to be reading this that I may not want to rub the wrong way. If you are a professional writing for that professional audience, that same professional audience, there are a lot of dynamics in play that might prevent you from being a true independent voice, I think.
Right. So I want to come back to that
Yeah.
idea about being entangled, but I want to ask you, as a journalist, somebody writing about design as a profession, when you read what designers are writing about design, what comes to mind? Do you just giggle, or?
No, I think there are two modes. I think we need to discern what design news is and design criticism. So there's definitely a lot of design news, like this happened, a lot of pointing, which is kind of part of my job. Pantone did this, like Apple did this. And some do it better than others. Some design news is kind of like just TMZ reporting, oh my gosh, they did this. That's when you roll your eyes.
If only design was that sexy, though.
It could be. I think we just need like background music and like hipsters
Right, yeah.
sort of like around the table. It's funny because like they're in the stream of news, so they seem equal to, oh, there's a new French president, right? But when you actually click on it, it's just sort of like this thing, but it's not really giving me more. So sometimes I'm disappointed. I'm always rooting for good design writing,
Yeah.
and I'm often disappointed with like, I guess, like American journalism.
Yeah, let's try to stay on topic if we can.
Yes.
Yeah.
American design journalism, I should say.
So just going back to this idea of, I think you used the word entangled, and when designers write about design, a lot of times they are writing as somebody who just completed a project for a client, and so they're kind of promoting that project, or they're writing in the context of, they're at a young company and they want to promote the idea of that product, and or recruiting for an open position. So to some extent, these are conflicts of interest that inform a lot of what bubbles up on the the leaderboards of design writing, whether it's Sidebar or Designer News or what have you. What do you think about that? Is that a cause for concern, or is that just the nature of our industry?
I think it's a cause for concern. I'm concerned, and I feel like designers should be concerned too. I mean, I think it is valuable to have someone who is, let's say, coming from a relatively neutral position, commenting and evaluating on your work. And I think not having that is bad for everyone. So I think, unfortunately, the actual profession of being a critic is under siege, perhaps, and there really are very few staff positions where people have the title of critic anymore. New York Times, LA Times, the Chronicle have art critics and architecture critics. No dedicated design critics per se. Often writing about design falls in the business or technology pages, which I think is fine, but there is definitely a hole, I think, for design, the role of design critic to be filled. And I think, designers writing about design themselves, obviously these are expert opinions and that certainly has value, but designers will tend to write more of a process story and more things that are really, let's say, granular about their work or their perspective on someone else's work, which is valuable. But going back to what I said originally, it probably doesn't take this work and put it in a broader cultural context, which is really what why we need criticism and why we need somebody taking a longer view on this type of work.
I love this definition of criticism by the film critic A.O. Scott. He said, criticism is to resist or rage against manufactured consensus. Sort of like, I think designers are super nice. We exist in this world of awesome, but A.O. Scott says the role of the critic is to question the successful and exalt the unknown. So I've been to a lot of design conferences, and when you scroll through blogs, everyone is just saying awesome, amazing, but usually not contextualized at all. And to me, design criticism or criticism is not just fault finding, but really saying why something is awesome, why something sucks, or highlighting a forgotten detail and why that's genius and the rest is crap. So there's a lot there.
Especially in the manufactured story. I mean, everybody has great PR teams working for them, and there's a story that's often publicly put out there, and but it may not be the whole story as far as the public concerned. So figuring out what the whole story is, or maybe another side of the story, is also, I think, what the critic wants to do.
Yeah, something that happens a lot when someone puts on a critic's hat in public is that I've seen designers tend to say that person is just trying to undermine the hard work of other people, and that if they really want to contribute to the craft, that they should just go and do a better job on a project of their own.
Yeah.
And get over that kind of reaction, that kind of instinct.
Yeah.
It's just a super childish, knee-jerk,
Yeah.
well, you do it, right? I think maybe critics need to win you, romance you with logic, kind of win you over. And criticism isn't, there's a lot of, people love to critique logos.
Yeah.
And that poses as design criticism, dislike, that sucks, that looks like a butt.
Yeah.
So, am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
But I think that's when you get the sort of reactionary, well, you do it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, but to some extent, the fact that when the Met redesigned their logo, or when brands put out their logo, Airbnb, and there's a big discussion online, and everybody's weighing in, and on Twitter and on Facebook and on blogs and Medium, and then the mainstream media picks up and writes a story. Could you argue that at least people are talking about design?
Kind of, but I don't think that's criticism at all. That's just dialogue. To critique is to critique not the object, but why it matters to the rest of what thing is it questioning? How does it better someone's company, so I think that's just sort of like inside baseball talk. And maybe the fast-paced media cycles need content, so that kind of like gets recycled as news.
So do you think those instances of highly intense popular dialogue are doing a disservice to our craft, or they are actually at least expanding design, the awareness of design a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, awareness is good. So I would say I would not say that those conversations are necessarily a bad thing. But it's not, like Ann said, doesn't count as criticism per se, or the kind of criticism, the level of criticism quality of criticism we would hope for. And the criticism doesn't always mean a negative or bad review of something. I mean, criticism can be a positive thing. And Inga Safran, who's the architecture critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, is known for kind of having really pointed reviews, but she wrote a great piece celebrating this new residential building in Philadelphia and how it worked with the street level. And she really held it up as an example of what architects and developers should shoot for in Philly, for example. And it was a really positive piece, and criticism can be that too. And I think one problem with writing online is just the speed factor and this reaction and having to feel like you need to respond immediately to something, and that's not the critic's role either. And I think we unfortunately don't build in that time, or sort of don't allow for writers to have that kind of time for reflection and long form journalism that we once did. And I think it's a problem for people who want to do criticism to try to figure out how they can develop their work and have their voice heard in this kind of crazy news cycle that we've got going on.
I do want to say that thoughtful comments are super valuable. I think criticism essentially is an argument for thinking. Versus making, right? It's a pro-thinking stance. So there could be raw material for something. So I think there's value in that. And Alexander Lang, an architecture critic, says criticism is love. And I've thought about that. And I think criticism is basically attention, which is so precious these days. As a critic, you're sifting through the good and the bad of a process or something. So when those thoughtful and considered comments happen, I think it's good for the industry, actually.
So I've heard both you mention architecture as maybe the closest parallels to visual design, user experience design, whatever. Those are the closest examples that we can turn to for what kind of criticism we might have in design. And I have a bias towards software design, user interface design, and so forth. And I've seen this consistently throughout my career. Is like when we talk about criticism and design, we tend to talk about the physical. We tend to talk about architecture, urban design, industrial design, and it seems like it's harder for us to have conversations about what you were saying earlier, is how technology, the immaterial, is really changing the material world in significant ways. Do you have any thoughts on why that is and how we might actually have a discussion about that kind of design?
About digital design?
Yeah.
I think digital design sort of exists as its own, but it always has some effect on someone. So I'm always interested in. So when I'm writing a critical piece, I'm always looking at how this relates to science or sociology or anthropology or sort of some corollary, concern. I think there's something to critique about the form and the process, but also how it sits in the world. Kind of like the best architecture critics, would also see how people are living in these magnificent buildings too. So for me, my way in there is how it actually changes lives and how it changes behavior. I think.
Yeah, I agree with Anne, and I think. Well, I'll give an example. We had Caroline Sinders, who at the time was working with IBM Watson and working on designing algorithms, and specifically for allowing people to comment. And she actually had her own side project going on at the time as well, with sort of I guess an art kind of project with related to the idea of bullying online, and thinking about the words we choose and reactions to them online. And I think being able to take something like the design of an algorithm and sort of pull back and think about it in context, and as Anne said, start to see the ripple effects and impacts, and kind of work back to it from that, I think may be a way to go. Because I think that's really why we are so interested in, or let's say, writers and critics have been kind of drawn to write about architecture, for example, is because the impacts are so obvious. At the scale is profound, and the impacts on a neighborhood or a city can be profound with architecture or urban planning. And if you think about it, and the way some of these, let's say, more digitally based designs are working now, the scale can be equally profound, but it's just not localized in one place, perhaps.
So you think the distributed nature of the impact is making it more difficult to have the discussion?
I think it is an argument for the reason to have a discussion,
see.
and I think it's just maybe a little harder to see it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's, when an important, quote unquote, important building goes up, there's, thousands of words written, but, there are examples in the very recent past of design decisions in products, digital products, that have really important impacts on our world. I mean, just look at the election there, and there's at least a half a dozen really concrete stories that you could dig into about how design played a role in that, and the writing on that has been relatively scant. Would you say?
Yeah, it's a problem.
I think with election, people are just prone to critique. I've seen so many, I'm sick of stories about election stickers, the I voted sticker.
Yeah.
Like, someone needs to discuss why voting here is so hard and tedious, and why the lines are so long.
Yeah.
Where are the great, I think I wrote a story inquiry, why are the great American interaction designers, why are they not working here? So we're prone to critique the ones that are manifest, like the form, the ballot, the ones we can see, but the invisible, I mean, that's a designer's role too. And it kind of takes two steps to say that it's a designer's fault and to call out the designer.
Right.
Maybe.
But what I see happening a lot is that you take a certain issue or problem, and design might be at the heart of it, but whatever it's coupled with, whether it's architecture or wayfinding in urban planning, or if it's coupled with like Facebook or Twitter, the discussion tends not to be about design, but it tends to be about that other thing that it's coupled with, because it's easier to understand. And I think mostly because people don't know how to talk about design. Would you agree? So I wonder, this is a roundabout way of asking the question. We all laugh that when we say our parents don't understand what it is we do, as designers anyway. My parents have no idea what I do. But I feel like that is, to some extent, irresponsible. We've been kicking the can down the road for a while and essentially shirking responsibility for defining design to the world, because its impact, we're saying, is so real. What do you think of that? I mean, should we try to define design and have a conversation from there? And will that change the conversation?
I don't think we should wait.
Yeah.
I think we should. It's high time, and the reason, for me, one of the reasons why design is so difficult is because it's so multifaceted. I mean, just reporting on design, I find that I need to be articulate in graphic design, wayfinding, web design, sort of all these things again. But I think we just need to talk concretely, and cite examples as design. I often, for example, sometimes I'm I think elevator buttons are terrible. They're like kind of, and whenever I'm in a bad situation, I'm always like, a designer is to blame here. Like I'm always thinking this way and like telling, this is a design fault.
Yeah.
So, I think we just need to speak in concrete terms and not wait for the polemic to sort of like settle and find a grounding for it.
Well, the designer's response is it's always the engineer's fault, just like you know.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Let me ask you though, like when you think about that, like what is the likelihood that people are ever going to care about this stuff? You know, I mean, when we talk about interface design, there are the particulars of interface design, the things that make it interesting to designers. When you try to talk about it to somebody else, they'll laugh, right? They find it implausible that it matters whether there are like extra lines at the end of a letter, a character or not, or if there's more spacing or not, or there's color or not. And I just wonder, to some extent, is it realistic to say that we'll ever get a mass audience to care about design?
Yes, it's realistic, I have hope. But I think it is more a matter of vocabulary and terminology and language, and the designers getting out of their design mode and putting themselves in the role of the user and being able to talk to a user about what makes this good and exciting and a good experience for the user.
But I would argue that designers say they do that every single day, that they put themselves in the shoes of a user and advocate for the user's needs.
But do they really? I mean, no. I mean, I'm not sure that's. I mean, maybe they try to, but are they sitting down with a guy off the street and talking to that person about, you know, her experience of this interface? I mean, I think, you know, it is because, you know, using terms that are coming from the design world and more kind of formal terms is, you know, potentially automatically putting up a barrier, and maybe ultimately, yes, like that kind of vocabulary will become a part of a user vocabulary too, and could hope, but we're probably not there yet. So I think figuring out how to even like generate and have these conversations beyond the design world is like first priority right now.
So just so that I'm clear, it sounds like you're saying that even if a designer engages real users to understand their reactions to an interface, they're not subsequently having a conversation with these users about what it means to have this experience or to understand the experience or
Right.
to expand the vocabulary. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a user's coming into a focus group and they're kind of observing and watching and getting feedback perhaps.
The user's
but
being observed but not engaged.
Exactly, yeah.
I was thinking designers should own up to the triumphs and the pitfalls of their creation and not behind the engineer. I mean, that's the only way. Like, why does it take me a longer time reading through my Twitter? Oh, it's because of the new format. It sort of like has more space, or like
Right.
kind of define what I did. Is it good or not?
Yeah.
And the more that we can sort of like own up to what we did, I think that's how we get like legitimacy.
Yeah, and you know, it is like design is part of a substantial process and, you know, team that includes multiple players, including the engineer and other people. And I think, but design is, you know, in some ways maybe the most human, you know, element happening at work here. And I think then, you know, it becomes incumbent on the designer to kind of take the lead in, you know, generating that conversation with the humans they're designing for.
I'm gonna say something provocative. I think designers maybe should stop thinking that they're super special. Like, we are part of one company, you know, like we're sort of another kind.
So just really special, not super special.
Just insanely Ne plus ultra special. Yeah. No, like, you know, designers sort of hide behind the quirks with the stereotypes of design. The people who wear black, like fonts, huddle over there, you know, the stereotypes. And we get away with shit, to be honest. because we're couched in that stereotype. But if we actually like step into the sunlight and say, actually, we're just a regular worker, like here to solve problems with our own tools, like that's actually harder because there cease to be like excuses for, our quirky behavior and our, ironic T-shirts.
So do you think that there's a tendency towards a cult of personality in design that has some role in inhibiting criticism? It's because people are afraid of these design superstars to some extent, afraid of crossing them, or like everybody wants to go work with Johnny Ive eventually, but don't necessarily want to criticize what he has to say.
I think not just that, but also there are companies who seem to skirt or above criticism, especially the companies who give money to design.
Right.
So personalities, idols, like I have my own design idols. Like I'm always struggling how to somehow say, I don't know about that. Like, sometimes kind of that Netflix show, Abstract.
Abstract.
Like, it contains all our design idols. And I struggled how to say something bad about it.
Why?
Actually, I think it's a very great commercial for design, but it's not a documentary.
Right.
I think it's a very incredible. Also, design is the opposite of abstract. Design is concrete, and to wax poetic about this like process with like crazy effects is to do us a disservice. Design is its own drama.
Yeah.
If the producer had only investigated or like did some legwork and not just repackaged a conference talk, I think it would have been more informative. But that's just me.
What did you think of
Abstract?
Abstract?
Well,
How many stars would you give it?
I have to
Thumbs up or
say-
thumbs down?
I have to say I did not watch all of them because I
fell asleep.
I fell asleep. Yeah, no, I tuned
mean,
out.
come on.
I mean, I think it was. I know they were done by different directors. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so I think some of them ran at a different pace than others. I was actually speaking to one of our students who, one of my favorite episodes was about Paula Scher, the Pentagram partner, and who, I think she does great work and has a really interesting story and point of view. And but one of our students she's doing a project about female designers, and she said, well, why did they have to give so much airtime to Seymour Quast, her husband, who is also a well-known designer, and why did he have to play such a large role in the documentary? And it's kind of an interesting question. I mean, there's certainly very much a unit, but I found that the whole series was not what I hoped. I agree with Anne. It was a little too superficial.
And no interaction designer. I feel like the most consequential, But there was a photographer in there. Anyway, lots to say about it.
I mean, I think it goes back to a generally kind of blurry idea of what design is. It's
It makes it
kind of
blurrier.
Design is
vaguely
special.
creative, vaguely commercial at the same time. So
Yes.
if a photographer is basically that, right? So yeah. Not to besmirk photographers. So let me ask, like how we improve the situation, and I want to ask. There are two tracks. First, like just generally, what can we do to turn this fairly, if you forgive the term, abstract conversation into something that we can take action on that is concrete. But before that, let me ask if I'm a designer, or maybe even I'm somebody in your graduate program, what are the prospects for making a living doing this kind of thinking?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is an issue. I mean, we do have quite a few students who go on to work at publications and have staff positions as writers, editors, and then through that may go on to have opportunities to write criticism. But what we also have is students who are designers who are coming into the program because they are interested in continuing on as designers, but at operating at a higher level. So what we often have is students who come in and go through our program and really learn the ropes of journalism and how to report well and how to write well and how to think critically and take a critical point of view on something, and then go back to their companies at a different level, in a different, possibly more strategic kind of role, and really have more impact. So I think that's another consideration for designers, thinking about their toolbox, that writing is one of the most important tools I think a designer can have, and being able to develop that and cultivate that, or at least like identify people as part of your team who have interest and skills in that area, because I think what writing is, good writing is a reflection of good thinking. Like clear writing is, you cannot have clear writing if you don't have clear thinking. So if you can't sit down with your team at any phase of a project and write down what's happening, or start to map out a compelling narrative about what you're doing for your client, maybe you don't have all your thoughts quite together or clearly defined.
Well, I mean, I certainly applaud any designer who endeavors to learn how to write more gooder.
Yeah.
But I wonder if they're just going back into the design trade, are they really helping us with this problem of a lack of design criticism?
Well, not everybody's going to go out and be
Sure.
a design critic. So,
And why is that? Is it because of just the economics of it, the lack of
yeah,
opportunity?
that's one issue. That's one very real world issue, is that, if you choose this path, you're probably, let's say, professionally going to identify as a journalist and have a staff position at some newspaper or publication, and it's just journalism is it's in a transitional time, and so frankly, I wish there were more full-time jobs with benefits for people who want to write design criticism, but there aren't. So I think we need a few very good, dedicated design critics, and then I think we do need people on the inside who are receptive to it.
Yeah.
I think that's equally important.
I mean, to have intellectual autonomy, you kind of have to have some kind of intellectual or financial independence too. Because if you're thinking about, gosh, writers aren't really paid well, neither journalists, when is the next paycheck going to come from? And maybe that compromises your freedom to say things. I think when we were chatting, I was once offered in South by Southwest. I was once offered to ghostwrite when a speech for a very big architecture firm. It's like, if you're ever tired of hustling, do these secret jobs with no bylines. So I think
A lot of respectable writers do that. I mean, to be clear, it's
yes.
not. It's not that it's shameful. It's just
totally. But I was thinking, gosh, these are the companies that I'm writing about, or I'm critiquing. So it was sort of fuzzy, but I totally see how that's a viable path for some writers.
Well, what's your experience been as a writer? I mean, what is the market's demand for criticism versus pointing, I think, as you said earlier, or just reporting on current events?
Pointing or current events is the quick news, the 250 word, this happened. Criticism, so to write a review takes about 3 to 4 days, and it's not, probably for the fast-paced media cycle, that's not really a great use of, or the most financially wise use of a reporter's time. But my editors encourage it. It's kind of where the liveliest thinking happens, and that's how a publication forms a personality. So
So that's not unique to Quartz or Quartz's mission?
Quartz loves it whenever. They said my funniest writing is when I'm incensed or bitchy, or I think I call things like goopy lasagna or whatever. So they encourage it when editors actually try to anger me so I can write
really?
more critically. So, but the financial aspect is definitely a thing to work out.
Yeah,
and the independent thinking.
But I think there's other opportunities for putting forth critical points of view that may not take the form of writing or a critical review. And that can be in the form of a museum exhibition. It can be in the form of an event, and that has a particular outlook. And so, I think there are opportunities for people who maybe don't have. Are not on staff at a publication or have the wherewithal or means to, kind of take this very independent role as a design critic to find opportunities, outside their work to do things that may, push the conversation forward or, go outside of, people's comfort zone a bit.
So how do we create more economic opportunity for good criticism? I mean, you mentioned earlier there are companies out there who are known as somewhat patrons of design, like the Targets of the world. Is that the path to creating an appetite for the kind of thing that we're talking about here, or is there some other shift that needs to happen that you can think of, or does one big publication like, I don't know, like the Times or somebody just need to take a leap of faith and put a full-time design critic on their staff? What needs to happen to change?
Like, yes.
I mean, all that will help. Like it's a signal, but the Targets of the world and the IBMs, like I don't know. I think first of all we need to develop a tougher skin for criticism.
Yeah.
I feel like all the companies I've written critical things about, they'll probably never invite me to that. But it's to know that when companies maybe need to realize that when a writer is critiquing something, it's not the whole company. I recently interviewed this writer, Mike Langford, who wrote a biography of Leonardo da Vinci. And he says, this theory of genius, he says, how when a company or a person is dubbed a genius, people tend to think they're genius forever. But he says, genius is temporary. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius many times, but not a permanent genius. And in as much as Apple is great, and Adobe and all these, Target, all these companies, not everything they do is great. So I think maybe they should welcome that, and maybe that informs other things in the future.
Yeah, if you can take the long view, if companies can take the long view, design criticism will help raise all boats, I think in the long run. It, brings attention to design by the consumers. It, raises the bar for designers and companies. And, I think ultimately that's what we want. That's a great thing. I think back to ID Magazine, the days of ID Magazine, and just think about, what would ID be covering today? And maybe it would be moving more into covering digital design, things in that realm. But I think that's in some ways what's missing. And I think there's not only a place for a design critic at newspapers like the Times, but I think there's maybe there's a place for a design publication. ID folded because it wasn't able to get a advertising base in place. This was back in the the late 90s, but maybe things are different now, and a magazine like ID could have another go at it and actually be really successful.
So how about individually, designers or consumers of design or design writing, or even people who just are passionate about design and they may have no direct role in the design industry? What can we do to make the environment more conducive to good criticism? You mentioned having tougher skin. Everybody should just grow up.
I think that we should kind of imbibe this notion of, I think we need also, aside from tougher skin, maybe some smidgen of skepticism. Whenever design is always so good at presenting you a beautiful plate, right?
Yeah.
And I've learned not just to admire the plate, but to ask, where did this come from? who made it, sort of like, but like training ourselves to sort of like question this beautiful form. And we designers are creating those things too, but like, could we be thinking about kind of the behind the scenes, which I'm always interested about. I think we had discussed this. So speaking of Target, Target did this sort of like dinner recently where they used 16,000 edible eggs for just a few hours dinner.
Just as
and
decoration
Just
on
as
the wall.
decoration on the
Yeah,
wall
yeah.
to suss out this sort of like kind of corny cliche, like to hatch ideas
Yeah.
or whatever. But
Oh, I get it.
16,000, right? You like it? You get it? But they said they were recycled, or like donated, so nothing was wasted. And I'm like, and it's beautiful form. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh yeah?
Yeah.
So I asked Target, really, it's not wasted, so where did it go? And they said it was donated to a farm. I'm like, oh yeah? So I called the driver who delivered the eggs. I found him in Canada. It's like, what kind of eggs? Are they human grade? Whatever, whatever, whatever. And so he gave me the details and the slip and whatever. And they were edible eggs. And I called the people who took the eggs. It turned out that edible eggs, for eggs to be edible, they need to be refrigerated. But Target had been constructing this, like Great Wall of Eggs for 3 years or three days. So they had been out of refrigeration, so the food banks couldn't take them.
Yeah.
So I called the farm that they donated to. The woman was livid. She's like, man, before you do these conceptual things, you should really know. But so she had to drive, I think 2 hours or 4 hours from somewhere in Canada and pick up all the eggs, bring it to her pig farm, and she's running this organic farm, and she hates it because now she has to feed the pigs GMO eggs, and so she's saddled with the eggs because she thought it was unconscionable. But if I had only maybe admired the form,
Yeah.
I learned a lot about eggs, by the way, in that
Yeah.
story. It was sort of, and then this notion of like how we appease ourselves with like donation or like repurposing. So that was sort of a satisfying story.
Yeah, but I think there is great interest on the part of the public about, where things come from that are in their households now, and just there's I think a growing sense of interest and curiosity for various reasons, and sustainability and being among them that. People want to know about materials or off-gassing, and I think there's a much more awareness and interest in the ingredients of design, and it's just a matter of kind of, I think, framing it up as these are design problems, and you should understand it as a design problem. It's a constellation of these issues.
Great, thank
Yeah.
you. We have some time for some questions, so maybe I'd like to turn to the audience if there's questions, and I think there's a mic somewhere out here. I'll take a question from here in the center.
Hi, thank you. It's been a very interesting talk. You've talked a lot about raising the awareness in the general public of bad design that just wasn't well executed. I'm curious what your thoughts are about raising awareness in the general public about bad design that is intentionally harmful, sort of the digital equivalent of the casino that has no clocks and no windows, so you have no idea how long you're in there. How do we raise the awareness of that so that we hold companies and designers accountable for doing things that are intentionally not in the best interest of the user?
Yeah,
Yes.
no, I think those are extremely important issues and problems, and I think that's why you want an independent critic and someone who is not necessarily, part of the architecture world or design world and writing for a trade publication, perhaps, because these are kind of greater issues about sociology, perhaps, or psychology that are coming into play that should become part of a bigger review. And I have seen that in the past, with specifically about casinos, that there have been some writers who have been like, well, let's just look at, let's like forget about like what the ceiling looks like, and let's think about the fact that there, nobody knows what time of day it is because precisely there are no windows. So I think that is exactly what you want a critic to be doing, is putting things in this larger context and talking about why it matters for people.
I think the critic, or we now know that that's the case, but I bet you the press release to the casino didn't say, "We'll trap you for hours."
Yeah.
It needs someone to ask a question or to interrogate to get to that, I think. Press releases kind of skip that.
I would say on that topic, not just scrutinizing the experience or the product, but also the fact that we basically have a generation of designers now who their definition of good design is optimizing for conversion, basically learning how to build these virtual casinos, and what's the long-term impact of people who are only thinking that way, building this sort of parallel world to us, I think is really important question to ask. Let's take another question. Yes.
So I was curious because designers always say that you're not the user, and I'm curious how design critiques approach that when they're not the user of the product, how they try to critique that product.
That's a great question.
I find someone who is the user and sit with them or interview them. It's not always me. So, and also sometimes I don't know how things are designed, so I look for a professor or a designer.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that's part of the reporting phase of writing criticism, is that if you can't put yourself, like literally, in the role of a user of a product and experience it yourself, or go to a building yourself, you must absolutely talk to people who are in that role of the user as part of your research process. That's absolutely a must-have.
And I think using the I or the first person critics should use it sparingly, because it's not always about me or how I loved it. So there's a line there, I think. I think we use I to reveal a bias. Like, this is what I know.
Yeah.
But like to say, I loved it. Like, it's like just whatever Facebook comment that should be relegated to a Facebook comment, not criticism, I think.
Yeah. And that's why, having someone writing as a critic who is not a designer or, in that role day to day of a designer, is important, because the designer is going to bring a lot of baggage to when they do try to put themselves in the role of the user. It's hard to switch those gears.
I'll take one more question, maybe from the back. This gentleman in the back here.
So at the beginning, you were talking about how a lot of the design criticism type of stuff that is done is actually designers writing for designers, and the problems you get into with that, where they're really focused on the process, or they're exalting like the minutia that really only other designers are interested in. And I was curious how nobody ever brought up product reviewers, right? Like people who do really good product reviews. And I expect you can make some distinctions there, but the question I have is, what might those distinctions be? If they do a really great product review, does it break through to the other side to be great design criticism? And is this the path forward? Like, is there an opportunity for that to fill the role that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, we didn't talk about that. But I think that type of review has great value. I think, it's sort of a category of criticism, I would say, and that's been around for a long time. If you think about, Consumer Reports magazine, and there's a great deal of value in that. And from someone writing from a user experience level, and I think you see proliferation of that on the internet now too, with people writing reviews, and occasionally you will find one that's done very thoughtfully and very well. I would say that's still different than what I would call more cultural criticism, which is trying to move beyond just to focus on the product and say, why is this product important in a bigger context, or relative to other products or a field or our lives right now. So that's what a critic will hopefully do. So I think there's room for all of it, but I think yeah, maybe that is sort of a way to think about the product reviews, or sort of a middle piece and maybe a bridge between kind of more like writing for trade publications and a cultural critique on two ends of a spectrum.
Cool.
Just want to thank everybody for showing up for this panel. It's actually really heartening to see people interested in this topic. And I'd also like to thank my panelists, Molly Hines and Ann Quito. You give them a round of applause, please. Thanks a lot. Good night.